Coming up on the Tall Mike Wine Podcast.
The drink of choice in engineering school
let's hear about
was
this.
essentially a moonshine. In India, it's called country liquor because it was made in the country, but this liquor was made of anything and everything. And I forget whether it was like a wine Wednesday or a wine Friday. I suspect it was more of
This might be prior to the Wine Wednesday phenomenon. Who knows? Maybe even Taco Tuesday hadn't been invented yet.
No, I don't think so. I like the wine business enough that that's something I would like to be close to. Rather than putting my money in some stocks and bonds, I was like, let me plant a vineyard.
And now, the Tall Mike Wine Podcast.
And just like that, the podcast begins. This is the first podcast of what we hope to be a whole bunch, the Tall Mike Wine Podcast. And I will explain to you the genesis of that name. And if you've never met me before and you've happened upon this podcast by accident, I thank you. I hope you stick around and listen. My name's Mike. I'm a tall guy, and for about the last 25 years, I have been obsessed with wine. It started out as a fairly mild obsession when I was in my latter 20s. And then it led me into all sorts of nefarious things, my obsession with wine. One of those things was a career in the restaurant business for about 20 years, where I was in charge of wine lists and wine list development and beverage programs and all these things that happen in restaurants. And then for the last a little over 3 years, I've been working at an actual winery. So now I can say I'm in the wine business. We're bringing the show to you from a very nice room. It is a room we call the Vintner's Room here at Nicholson Ranch Winery in Sonoma, California. This is where the podcast will come from. At least that's the plan. And the reason that is because that is the winery where I am employed. Before I did all of the wine stuff in restaurants, I was actually behind a microphone for about 15 years. From the time I was a very young adult until I was in my early 30s, I was a disc jockey all over my native state of Washington. So now I am back behind a microphone, but not in a studio. I'm pushing all the buttons myself and putting this whole thing together. This is episode 1 of what we hope to be a whole bunch of episodes, but we'll see what happens. You're going to experience a lot of firsts because this is my first podcast and the first episode, and my first guest is here, and his name is Deepak Gulrajani. Deepak is the owner and winemaker here at Nicholson Ranch Winery in Sonoma. So yes, he is my boss. But he's actually a pretty amazing guy. You might have already kind of guessed from his name, he's not from here. So that in and of itself is pretty fascinating. He is a winemaker in California that was born and raised in Bombay, India. Welcome to the show, Deepak.
Thank you, Mike. My pleasure to be and very honored to be here on your inaugural podcast.
Thank you so much. Deepak and I are sipping wine. We just finished a session of tasting wine for the Nicholson Ranch Wine Club, and we're both sipping Pinot right now. Cheers, Deepak.
Cheers.
Let's talk about you. Now, I've worked for you for a little over 3 years. Actually, it'll be 4 years this summer. And slowly, over the course of the first few months and years, I got the gist of your story, which, as I said, is a pretty amazing story to think about. You know, there aren't too many people from India making wine in the United States. You know, I just kind of have it in the very broad strokes. You know, he was born in Bombay. He went off to engineering school. He came to the United States for grad school. He came to California, was turned on to wine, had an opportunity to plant a vineyard in the mid-'90s, and now he owns a winery, and the winery has been here since that time, 1995. But I want to go back and just fill in some of the real gaps to me. Like, you were a very small child in Bombay, India. Tell me about that. Tell me about you growing up. Like, what are some of your first memories? Because what I'm trying to get to is, like, how did it all happen? Were the seeds planted at a very young age? Tell me about your family life as a small boy.
Well, that's taken me back. That's really taken me back for sure. But talking about growing up in Bombay, you know, even in the 60s and 70s when I was growing up, Bombay was a city of maybe 8 million people. Today, it's probably well over 20 million people, but was always densely populated. The buildings that we lived in, the apartment building that I lived in, was about 6 stories tall. It was part of a compound of 3 buildings that were all kind of together. You made a lot of friends really easily. You always had a bunch of people in your own age group with similar interests. And as a young boy, all our interests tend to focus on cricket. That's the one thing you always did, even if you didn't have space. When, if you guys know a little bit about cricket, you see people wearing, white shirts and white pants and green grass cricket pitches, as they're called.
Right, the pitch.
But in Bombay, as I said, there's not a lot of green space, so you played in the parking lot in between the 2 apartment buildings.
So how old were you the first time you played cricket?
Probably maybe 6.
Okay, all right.
But I probably played it even before that because, it's like baseball. You have a bat and your ball, and you need 2 people, and that's pretty much it.
Right. You don't need a lot of stuff.
Don't need a lot of stuff.
And you can
really.
improvise.
You can improvise, so you can play with 2 people. You can play with 20 people. The formal game has got a lot more rules and all. Our little playground or parking lot game, we made up the rules as we went along.
So who's there in the house with you at this age? When you're young, you just started to play cricket, your parents are there. I know you have a sister.
My parents, my sister, but also my grandmother and one of my aunts. We all lived together. So we had about 6 people that we lived together, between 800 or 1,000 square feet. And in Bombay, that's a decent-sized apartment.
Okay.
Yeah, space was at a premium back then, and space is a premium today. So it's a very tight space, but was a very happy childhood.
Who was cooking the food?
That's the other thing that I actually remember a lot about my childhood is the smells and aromas of home, particularly of home. The rest of Bombay, too. My mom was the main cook, very traditional role in an Indian family. But though it was a traditional role, both my parents were not as traditional as you may think. My mother came from a southern part of India on the west coast, and my father came from a northern part was India and now is part of Pakistan. So the very northwest part of India. And their 2 cultures and their 2 cuisines are pretty different. My mother became quite adept at, I guess, bridging the cultures, marrying into effectively not just my father, but in India it'd be considered marrying into my father's family. She adopted a lot of the cultural norms and the cuisines of my father's family. And so growing up, she would do a lot of the cooking, but it was mainly North Indian cooking, very aromatic, a lot of clove and cinnamon and spices like that in the cooking.
Your mom's doing the cooking. Was there wine on the table?
No wine on the table. No wine on the table. India in the 70s or probably even into the 80s, India does not have a wine did not have a wine culture.
Okay.
India was ruled by the British Empire for 200 years, and so they certainly influenced a lot, but they particularly influenced the drinking habits of Indians. So for India, it's all about beer and scotch. Wine today has become an important component as well, as it has become globally, but when I was growing up, there was no wine at all.
So you're having dinner with your family as a youngster, and there's beer or scotch.
Yeah, my father would from time to time have a glass of scotch, or if guests came over, it would be beer or scotch would be primarily. Or if we went to somebody's house, and back in those days in India, that's what you primarily did, is people came over for dinner or you went over for dinner. Eating out was a rarity, and that was truly a celebration or something. But typically we went over to our families or friends' houses, or they'd come over. So one other part about being in Bombay was a melting of a lot of cultures in my family, but in many other families. So if you want to visit somebody else, very likely they came from some other part of India, which also meant their cuisine was pretty different from what you ate at home.
Okay, so there's something analogous here to what happens in this country, I guess. If you look at the big cities, Bombay is a big city. You go to big cities nowadays in the United States, most people are from somewhere else because they've moved there, because that's where the jobs are.
Yeah.
And they bring their culture, traditions.
Yeah, but for India, it was pretty unusual. So India got independence in 1947. Prior to that, it was ruled by the British. Most people grew up, lived their entire lives in the state where they were born in. So there wasn't much blending of cultures. Bombay was always an important trading port. It was really a commercial city. So over the decades, it had certainly become a little more multicultural. But what really opened the floodgates on that was when India got independence. And the British left, and people had to kind of fend for themselves, and people came to Bombay to get jobs. Both my parents came to Bombay as teenagers, looking for work. And that's probably a pretty common story, and so it drew in a lot of people from all over India, from all these different cultures, just looking to make a living, but also it also meant that they were not bound by the culture or the norms of their own state to their own ancestral village or town and so on.
You get away from home.
Time,
You get away from mom and dad. You move to the big city. You can kind of let your freak flag fly a little.
Yeah, so Bombay was pretty much in that sense culturally progressive. Actually, coming back to my interest in wine, this only struck me many, many years into actually once I was making wine. I was an established winemaker. Was one of my father's friends. Growing up in a big city, I didn't know where tea came from, whether it came from a plant or from something else. But when I was about 10 or 12, I met this gentleman who was a good friend of my father, and his job was described to me as a tea taster. I never connected the dots. I never quite understood what a tea taster meant. But years later, I understood that it was somebody who graded all the tea. Tea grows on a plant, on a bush, and the leaves are plucked, and then the leaves are dried out, or sometimes slightly fermented and dried out. And in the process, you get many different qualities of tea. The whole leaf tea is considered the best, and then what's left at the end of this process is called tea dust, and that's your least best quality, but it can produce a very nice, strong cup of tea. Okay. And a tea taster's job is to actually grade from top to bottom all of this. And so he would talk about it, and I thought it was fascinating. I didn't understand any of it, but it was just one of these exotic things as a young person, probably just stuck in my mind. I won't say I thought about it much till I actually became a real winemaker. And that planted some seed in my head that this was interesting.
Something subliminal about...
It was interesting.
Did you drink a lot of tea?
Yeah, but mostly of the dust variety.
Okay.
Nothing fancy, just kind of stuff that was, in India, the word they use is kadak, which all means is strong, a strong cup of tea.
All right, let's move forward. You went off to engineering school, like all the good Indian boys. Was there beer?
Yeah, there wasn't that much beer, but even my path to going to engineering school was not as direct. Initially, actually, I thought about going to agricultural school. For about a year, I kind of pursued that, thinking I'd go to agricultural school. And I have no idea why I thought about it, but I was pretty serious about it till my mom, I think, had enough of my talk of going to agricultural school. And she said, "What are you talking about? Like, we own no land. We don't know anybody who has any land." This is now the late 70s, early 80s, and working in agriculture wasn't much of a profession as such. After about a year, I said, "Yeah, Mom, you're probably right," and said, "Maybe I go to engineering school."
So then you're off to engineering school, not really having too much beer at engineering school.
So the drink of choice at engineering school
let's hear
was essentially a moonshine.
Okay.
In India, it's called country liquor. And I guess because it was made in the country, but this liquor was made of probably anything and everything. At the end, what you got was a really clear liquid, fire water.
Well, you got a bunch of engineers building stills. That had to be fairly efficient, right?
Exactly.
They know the science.
Yeah.
So were these guys making their own?
Some were, but more often than not, you just walked outside of the campus and there'd be a liquor store that would be selling some of this country liquor. And much of this country liquor was safe in terms of that it had been certified to be safe by the local government. Because
nobody was going blind.
Yes, exactly. Nobody was going blind. But when you talk about flavor profile of this stuff, I would say not much. It's very distinct for sure. So even if I have a sip today, which I don't think I've had a sip in 30, 40 years now, but I think I could identify it right away.
Wow.
Though if you asked me to write down, okay, what aromas it has, I probably couldn't come up with many words.
I always like to say it smells like rocket fuel.
Maybe that's what it is. It's a very distinct kind of rocket fuel. Go.
Whenever I'm somewhere having a meal in a restaurant and somebody wants an after dinner libation and somebody starts talking about grappa, that's what I start thinking about is rocket fuel. Because to me, that's what grappa smells like to me. It's bright.
I think probably that's a good, think of the worst grappa you ever had.
Okay.
That's
Let's move forward. You got your engineering degree, computer science. You came to the United States, NYU, business school. Tell me about the culture shock.
Yeah, so I came to New York to go to business school. New York was not as much of a culture shock. In some ways, being another big city, similar to a big city like Bombay, with very different cultures. But on a day-to-day basis, people were kind of the same. I mean, in terms of when you're standing in line for a bus, you didn't make conversation. You did not make conversation with the person standing in front of you. People would think that would be strange.
That's in New York.
Oh, and true in Bombay, too.
And in Bombay, okay.
And true in Bombay, too.
And in New York, nobody's come to your house asking you to go play cricket with them.
Yeah, New York is a bunch of big buildings.
Maybe stickball. If you're out in the hoods.
There's not a lot of green space in most of New York, except for Central Park, I guess.
Was there any wine in your experience at NYU? Nice dinners?
No.
Glass of wine?
I think my biggest impression from a aromatic point of view is probably coffee more than wine.
Okay.
My student apartment was in Greenwich Village, and so I think got exposed to coffee and music.
Okay.
Not much wine.
So you finish up college, you get your master's degree. How did you end up in California?
I always thought I'd be in New York.
Doing what job?
I thought because I had a degree in technology and computer science specifically, and then I had a master's degree in finance. And being in New York, I always thought I'd be working probably on Wall Street.
Sure.
They hired a lot of people and the pay was good, so I was like, okay, that sounds good to me. As it turned out, in October of 1987, that was probably one of the biggest stock market crashes. It was the biggest stock market crash since the Great Depression, so it really set things back.
What was that one called? Was that Black Monday? Black Wednesday?
Black Monday.
Monday, okay.
Black
I
Monday.
I think
it was October 17th or October 19th.
I remember they called it Black
of 1987.
One of the days of the week. Okay.
And that pretty much rolled back a lot of people's plans, including mine. New York and that area went through a very big recession. People were getting laid off. There were no jobs. There was almost no chance of getting hired. But I got a chance to talk to a lot of people. I mean, I got a lot of interviews for jobs, and that itself was an education for me to talking to people.
Interviews at what kind of companies?
Most of these were big, those days, big Wall Street firms. Some of them don't exist anymore. Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers.
Okay, so things that
some do.
I'm a layman in this particular realm. I would think of that's a brokerage firm or a banking firm.
Yeah, it was getting late into spring, so about May, June, and I didn't have a job, and I went to this one interview, and This gentleman, I guess, was very astute. He couldn't offer me a job, but he offered me very good advice. He said, go call this company up in California. They're probably a really good fit for you. And so I sent a letter back in, this was now in 1988. I know we did not have internet, so I sent a letter.
With a stamp on it.
With a stamp on it to the president of this company in what turned out to be Berkeley, California. And I was surprised. In about 3 weeks, I got a letter back saying, would you like to come for an interview on such and such date in June?
There are some young people listening to this show right now that are saying, 3 weeks?
Yeah. But a letter did come back inviting me for the interview, and I don't know whether I sent a letter back or I may have called on the phone to set up, firm up the plans. And I came in June to Berkeley, California for the interview, and it was an all-day interview. And the person I worked for became my boss was this sort of jovial-looking, not a very jovial personality, a Frenchman from Alsace, whose name is Daniel Beck.
All right. We're talking about French people now.
Yeah.
I'm sniffing a little bit of wine coming into your atmosphere.
Yeah. We went out to lunch the day of the interview, and only weeks or months later I realized the place we went to lunch was the Cafe of Chez Panisse.
Oh my goodness.
Chez Panisse is, for people in the Bay Area, most people know Chez Panisse is this iconic farm-to-table, the first really well-known farm-to-table restaurant in the Bay Area. Alice Waters is the owner and chef. Restaurant opened, I think, either in the late 60s or early 70s.
I think you're right.
And
somewhere in that time frame for sure.
And so it was, by the time I got to eat there, it was already famous, but I didn't know that stuff. Months later, I realized.
You didn't know that stuff?
Oh, I did not know. Yeah, when I had lunch there, it was like, I just won the job. I didn't care where I had lunch. But we had wine, glass of wine, and I don't remember what it was. Mm-hmm. But I did get the job, and I came to work for this company in Berkeley in July of 1988. And what I do remember about wine is I was here by myself. I'd never been to California ever in my life before. I didn't know a single person here. But the company I worked for had a lot of young people, and they organized a weekly wine tasting.
This is at work?
This is at work. And I forget whether it was like a wine Wednesday or a wine Friday. I suspect it was more a Friday. The company was probably more like a Friday.
This might be prior to the Wine Wednesday phenomenon.
Yeah.
This might, who knows, maybe even Taco Tuesday hadn't been invented yet.
No, I don't think so.
All right, so they're having Wine Friday at work.
Yeah. And
you're working for a French guy.
Turned out there were a lot of wine connoisseurs at work. Many from California itself, but this company had people from many other countries as well. Every week was pretty interesting. The wine tastings turned out to be pretty interesting. A lot of California wine, but a lot of wines from other parts of the world.
This was an interesting time because the late 80s, the California wine industry was definitely on the map, but I think a lot of people in the United States still drank a lot of European wine.
Yeah, and certainly on the East Coast, California wine really hadn't made its mark.
Right.
I mean, yes, California wine, the Judgment of Paris, those stories had been written about and talked about, but on a day-to-day, people going to a nice restaurant on the East Coast, would still order a French wine,
right.
Less likely California wine.
Because of that history.
Yeah.
But by the late 80s...
But in California, if you went to a restaurant...
Right.
Oh, no doubt they were showcasing California wine and were very proud to do that. So if you walked into any good restaurant in the Bay Area at that time, and at that point that was more focused in San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley.
Well, Berkeley had its groove on as far as restaurants went, so they must have had its groove on as far as wine. And you have a lot of educated people in Berkeley.
Yeah, and there were a couple of really good wine merchants in Berkeley. K&L was one primary one.
Was Kermit there yet?
Kermit Lynch.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, Kermit Lynch. Exactly. No, thank you. Yeah.
Still in Berkeley.
Yeah, still in Berkeley. They had really good selections of wines, so you could find many good wines out there. But through these wine tastings at work, I landed up making friends with other people who had interest in wine outside of work. And we started meeting up for our own wine tastings at one of our homes.
Okay.
And
now,
doing that.
Do any of the wines you tasted back then, could we trace back to the first one? You were like, oh, this is good wine. This is interesting to me. Like there's something that began the process of pulling you into wine more as a thing that was important to you as opposed to a fun thing to share with the people at work, with your friends.
Initially, it certainly just was a fun thing, gave me a way to meet other people. But with time, I wouldn't say there was one wine, but certainly there was one varietal that drew me in. It was Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir, at that point, was still just Burgundy or a small pocket of people in Sonoma. And even in Sonoma County, those of you know Sonoma County, it was just Russian River and Carneros. I'd never heard of an Oregon Pinot. I'd never heard of a Santa Barbara Pinot at that time. And they well may have been, but the word hadn't gotten out.
No, I'm sure at that time, if there was Santa Barbara Pinot, there wasn't a lot of it.
But Pinot, I had probably drank every kind of wines, Zinfandel, Cabernet, Syrah, but Pinot just intrigued me. Part of what I remember, what intrigued me about it was these wine tastings that we did, and theme would be whatever, a vintage from Russian River.
Okay.
Let's say
Specific
1985 Russian River Pinots. And you had a whole, maybe 6 bottles of it, and we did all blind tasting, so we didn't know what the label was. And you taste it, and it was so different. I mean, and in many cases, the fruit came from the same vineyard. Rocchioli was one of the big growers, so it was common to have a lot of Rocchioli wine or wines by other vintners, but making grapes from Rocchioli.
Even back then, we were seeing the phenomenon of the single vineyard wine.
Even back then, Rocchioli had established itself, and people were putting Rocchioli's name on their label.
Okay.
But what was intriguing to me is that, they could all be the same vintage, 1985, all saying Rocchioli Vineyard, different winemakers, and the wines could be very different.
Right.
And that's kind of connected a lot with just the way I think, and it's like got me just engrossed into trying to find out why.
Okay.
And coming to all these wineries were largely, all Sonoma County, largely Russian River. So it was easy to go visit.
Okay. So you're visiting wineries.
And go meet the winemaker.
Okay.
And actually,
back in the day, you would go to a winery, and chances are, nowadays you go and it's a tasting room, and it's pretty far removed at a lot of places, especially bigger wineries, from the process of how the wines are made, the grapes are grown, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But back in the day, you might be at a winery and the winemaker might be pouring the wine for you.
Yeah, and back in the day, you almost expected to meet the winemaker.
Okay.
Because they'd be pouring the wines, or what we today call the vintner, the person who was responsible, the owner, who was also, back in those days, they were owners because they just loved wine. And the second part of it, loved talking about wine. So one thing you can guess, even from this podcast, all winemakers, we love talking about wine. And that was true back then too.
I feel like we're on the cusp of figuring out what pushed you into the realm of wanting to make your own wine. Because you started out in the garage. I know this story. This is one of those broad strokes that I know about you. You started making wine in your garage in Berkeley.
Yeah. Through all these tastings, I met up with a couple of friends who became good friends at that time that were making wine. And they were making wine with this third gentleman who was studying to be a doctor, and he got an offer to be a resident in all places Nebraska, so he decided to move there. And these 2 other guys needed a third partner because that's what they were used to. They said, you like wine. Would you like to make some wine with us? I was like, sure.
Oh, so the guy moved to Nebraska
Yeah.
You get to start making wine.
Started making wine. I'd been helping them,
Okay.
When you're making wine, you need a lot of hands.
Yes.
Particularly harvest time, particularly when it comes to bottling. Anybody's making wine pulls in all their friends. So I'd help these guys out with bottling and harvest a couple of times already. So
right, you were on the periphery, and now you were going to become a player.
Exactly. Well,
in the homemade garage wine
call
world.
it the homemade garage wine world. What was great about it, my days were spent, writing software code.
Okay.
In the fall, I got this chance to go out into the Russian River and go pick fruit. Initially we actually made Zinfandel, not Pinot Noir, because fruit was cheap, and everybody said it's easy to make Zinfandel.
Okay, it's hard to screw it up.
Yeah, hard to screw it up. So we went and picked the fruit, and the place we actually picked the fruit for was called Mays Canyon. And it was a canyon, which also meant the sun didn't really shine over there that much. It was cold, and we were picking Zinfandel in a cooler climate. Can take up to late October and sometimes early November to ripen.
Where is Mays Canyon?
Mays Canyon is in Russian River, and it's still there. The vineyard we bought fruit from is still there. It's called Port of Bass.
Okay.
But, that was what was nice for me, was being able to harvest fruit and then bring it to our garage in Berkeley to start with, and then we moved to San Francisco.
How much fruit did you have?
The first year we just made 1 barrel of wine, which means we needed about 1,000 pounds of fruit.
Okay, half a ton.
Yeah, half a ton. 1,000 pounds of fruit makes a barrel, and you have some wine left over that you can use for topping and so on. But a barrel of wine, so at the end, after a year, we would bottle this wine, and that would make about 300 bottles of wine. So each of us had 100 bottles of wine.
That's a pretty good supply until next year.
Yeah, but then we got more adventurous.
Okay.
And we said, how about we make 2 different types of wine? And the following year was 3, and so on. And we peaked at one year we made 7 different kinds of wine.
What?
At which point the joy kind of got out of it.
Now it's starting to feel like a job.
Exactly. So we cut back pretty fast, and
you made 7 different varietals.
Seven different varietals.
Using 7 different kinds of
7 different varietals one year, including a port. There was 1997, because that was the only year we made a port. That's why it's kind of stuck.
That's 1997.
Yeah.
That overlaps with when you actually got to plant a vineyard, which was 1995.
So my interest in home winemaking, I had an opportunity to plant. Well, I got an opportunity to plant a vineyard, and I took that, and so I started planting a vineyard here at Nicholson Ranch started in 1995.
So this is the Deepak that wanted to go to agricultural school, coming to the forefront to plant the vineyard.
I had worked for the software company, and the software company was sold, so I made a little bit of money, and so I had a little bit of money to invest. And I knew by then, I liked the wine business enough that that's something I would like to be close to. Rather than putting my money in some stocks and bonds, I was like, let me plant a vineyard.
Wow.
And that's really what I wanted to do. I wasn't thinking officially that I'm now in the wine business.
Right.
No, not at all.
Plant some grapes, and
I'm going to plant some grapes.
People will make wine from that.
Yeah, as well as I knew enough.
You'll be Deepak, the grape farmer.
Yeah. Also, I knew enough about the wine business to be kind of cautious about the financial aspects of the wine business, that I wasn't about to just jump into it. But I knew that I liked it enough that that if I grew good grapes, I could sell grapes. And as it turned out, I got to know some commercial winemakers that, in fact, helped me, advised me on what to plant. Now, I knew I was planting Pinot, but even in Pinot, there's a lot of varieties of what we call clones of Pinot.
Yes.
And they really helped me select clones of Pinot that they knew made good wine. So I got some really good advice from them, as well as good customers. So they, on the other side, said, you plant it, we'll buy it.
You decided on Pinot because you love Pinot, or because you knew that you were in a place where Pinot was going to be great?
No, I loved Pinot. And also I knew the place would support, the weather was really good for Pinot. So where we are is actually, the way the lines are drawn, the way where Nicholson Ranch is, it's in the Sonoma Coast appellation. However, it's bordered on three sides by the Carneros appellation.
Yeah, we're right across the street from Carneros.
Yeah. And everybody, and in 1995, we thought we were part of Carneros as well. So there was Pinot Noir and Chardonnay being grown in this area, and some really high quality stuff at this time. But the land I planted on had never been planted to grapes. So we did a lot of research, so which means you dig pits and pull out the soil from about 10 feet deep.
You get the soil people in.
You do soil analysis.
The soil scientists.
Soil science, exactly.
And look at the dirt.
You look at the dirt and you send it off to a lab and you touch it and you smell it and all of that. But, I had never planted a vineyard, so the touching and smelling didn't probably, beyond being exciting, I don't think informed me much at that point.
Well, you were smart, though. You brought the experts in. You followed the science.
Yeah.
At what point, while you're growing the grapes, selling the grapes to wineries, did the idea of building the winery come into play?
Probably three different things. One was the wine that these wineries made from our grapes, from my grapes, turned out to be very good. The two primary wineries that time who purchased our grapes, was Landmark, which is still around, and Pats and Hall, which is also still around. Both make really good wines. And they made really good wine back then, so that was encouraging for sure. The second thing, they could make good wine, and that meant I could make good wine, but how do I make good wine?
So you got wineries making good wine from your grapes, and this is a little bit of a hurdle here.
Making wine commercially is a much bigger challenge in terms of that it takes a lot more money, a lot more capital, because you're not buying just half a ton of grapes or 2 tons of grapes.
Right. You're just scaling up.
Scaling up.
Scaling up.
And if you're going to make good wine, you know that once you make the wine, it's going to take at least 3 years before you're going to sell the wine. So you got to invest the money now.
It's not like making country liquor.
And wait to get the revenue way down the road.
Right.
And so that was a big decision. But as luck would turn out, is the next company, this was probably 2 or 3 companies down the road that I worked for, also had some great success.
This is your day job still.
Yeah, my day job. So had good success, and this company sold as well. So again, I had some money to invest.
So you're still in the software industry. And this is also the late 90s. So what was happening in that world?
This is now late 90s, in fact.
So what's happening in that world? I mean, the internet is now a thing.
I was in technology, but it was technology that was being applied to the financial markets. And so by mid to late 90s, there was a big boom.
Yes.
First
.com boom.
First .com boom. The software company that I worked for built software for financial markets. People who had got trained at this company were the first to actually apply this financial technology in actually investing in the markets. So we were doing, I don't know what it'd be even called today, because I know everybody does it, is applying software and automatic trading or whatever it may call it in the markets.
Coming up with algorithms,
algorithms, exactly, our algorithmic trading.
Which, like you said, it's commonplace now. This is how
so we were doing this pretty early, start in about the mid 90s, but I also was very lucky to make some money at it. And I invested all that money into actually the wine business, into starting the winery.
So this is where Nicholson Ranch begins to be built.
Yep. So we decided, because the quality of the wine made from my grapes turned out to be really good, and I had the resources to do it, I now jumped in. So I will use that word carefully, because there was no turning back.
You've reached the point of no return.
Yeah, once you start a winery, there's not much else you can do with a winery. The half a winery, a half-built winery.
You can't do it halfway. We started a winery, now we got to make the best damn wine we can, and we got to sell it.
Exactly.
That's the key thing. Is you get into the wine business, and that's people think, oh, he's making wine. That's such a romantic thing. It's so, the vineyard and the grapes and harvest season. Think about all the movies, that you see. And it seems so romantic. But at the end of the day, you have to remember, you have to sell the wine that you make.
Yeah, all those romantic aspects are true. But there's a lot of other things in between. And one, you have to know how to run a business, how to sell the wine. There's a lot of there's a lot of regulation in the wine business, and you need to be able to deal with that and not be frustrated with that. But I think the key thing is, how do you sell the wine? And I use the word sell in the best possible way, by which I mean is, how do customers, somebody drinking a glass of wine, what do they appreciate?
Well, and how do they find you?
And both aspects of it. It's like, what is it in the quality of the wine, in which, what do they appreciate, and how do you connect with that? And two is then, how do they find you? Mm-hmm. And which I mean, finding where you can buy the wine, but really having some kind of intellectual or emotional connection to what they're drinking in the glass. And for me, that pretty much what made me enjoy wine and buy wine is, I would like the taste of it, but I was intrigued about where wine came from, why two winemakers from buying the same grapes made very different wine. And I love to talk about that. And that's what I talked about to people who came and enjoyed my wine, is why does my wine taste the way it does, and why does my neighbor's wine possibly taste different?
Right.
And it was just that conversation which probably made the connection. Physically, as well as physical accessibility, is Nicholson Ranch is very well situated on a main road connecting Napa and Sonoma. So that provided easy access to a lot of our customers and provided the opportunity for them to connect with this winery.
Let's talk about other things. Let's delve into your psyche a little bit. What else do you like to drink, Deepak? We've talked about country liquor.
Yeah.
If we go to dinner, what would you have before dinner if you weren't going to have wine right away?
A gin cocktail.
Oh.
Start with.
Yeah.
I like aromatics. Mm-hmm. And so gins really intrigue me. Gin by itself, but so gin with tonic water would be just fine,
sure.
Or club soda would be just fine. But any kind of gin cocktail, and then all the mixologists out there coming up with some really interesting one with a little bit of cucumber here.
So many.
Yeah.
So many options.
Yeah. And a traditional Negroni is also amazing to me.
You're making me thirsty now.
Yeah, no.
Even though I have wine in my glass. I have Pinot in my glass right now, and I've been sipping it while we've been talking. But
I would, if it's a big night out, I'd probably start off with a gin cocktail for sure.
We sort of touched on this. I was trying to get to the epiphany, the wine epiphany, the one wine. The first time you said, wow, this is amazing. I think you already talked about this just a little bit.
Yeah. But I think in that, tasting Burgundy, and particularly, sort of aged Burgundies, mm-hmm. was probably very, very interesting. The oldest wine I recall ever tasting is a 1966. And I don't remember exactly which appellation of Côte d'Or it was, but it was a Domaine Leroy. And I was pretty amazed, and I probably drank this wine sometime in the mid-2000s. So it was probably 40 years old at that point.
Oh, man. But this wasn't in the formative years.
No, but Burgundy in general, say Clos Vouget. Clos Vouget has 80 or 100 different winemakers that make wine from Clos Vouget. And so that same theme of different winemakers being able to do very different things with the same fruit plays out or played out in a magnified way in Burgundy. Right. And so you can find all these different Burgundies from different wineries and different winemakers. The other part of it was also just from a sensory profile. Burgundy was never all about fruit. It was always these sort of more ephemeral aromas, in which we generally start calling earthy or sometimes even barnyard. But usually it's aromas that you don't typically smell or expect to smell in a beverage. Mm-hmm. It's probably what it is. You don't expect to smell it in beverage or on a food, and you're smelling it and you're going earthy and barnyard, and it makes them distinctive in some ways. That was something that also, very easy to like create a sensory memory. That connection between a taste you like and creating this really specific memory of it is something that you always seem to go back to and always connect with.
Right.
And I think Burgundy probably highlights that for me for sure. And it's something even in California you kind of try and seek out. What is it about this wine that there's something in the taste of it, and there's something that you remember specifically, that connection. Once you have that connection, you can always identify. When I say identify, I don't mean consciously identify, but you get it.
Right.
I think you just get it where the wine's from.
Connection with that particular thing. So there was a smaller group of us here before we started rolling the digital tape for the podcast. Something that came up was a question that I actually had written down here on my pad. Why is wine so intimidating to a lot of people? I have people that come into the tasting room here, and one of the first things they will say to me is, I don't know anything about wine. Like, it's a big confession, and they want me to know that, and I just wonder why you think that is.
Well, let me talk about why people get intimidated possibly about wine, and we'll talk about mistake. I think people tend to get intimidated by wine because they come in here or to Nicholson Ranch or any tasting room or open a bottle and go out, and the first thing going through the mind is, what should I be tasting? And that's exactly the wrong thought or question that should be going through your mind. When you approach a bowl plate of food, you don't think about what should I be tasting. You just go ahead and taste.
Right.
And then you say, what did I taste? So with wine, I think a lot of people go like, what should I be tasting before they've ever had a sip? And that's exactly like backward. Somehow, through talk, publications, all of that, this mystique, and I'm doing the air quotes now, of wine's been built up where all people think is they should know something about the wine. No, you don't really need to. You don't know nothing about it. Just sip it.
I think it's almost better to know nothing.
Yeah, and just...
People come in and say, I don't know anything about wine. I say, good, I want to know what you think about our wine.
Yeah, just sip it.
I want to know what you say about our wine. Because there are people that come in that are wine people.
Yeah.
And they're kind of working from the same script.
Right.
It's Pinot. So we know what we're going to taste.
Right.
They're confident. Oh, it's Pinot. We know what we're supposed to taste. Yeah. The non-wine people are the fun people.
The non-wine people are a lot of fun people because you're going to get just like the truth out of them almost. I mean, it's just more to get them to be not intimidated about speaking their mind once they've had a sip of that wine.
All right, this is a weird question. Who would you love to drink a bottle of wine with, living or dead? What's the first thing that pops into your mind?
Probably, when I was talking about Domaine Leroy, probably her name is Lalou Bijou Leroy, and I may have got that wrong, but probably somebody like her. And
this is a woman.
This is a woman who was a winemaker and then had her own winery. And I don't know much more about her history, and I don't even know if she is with us right now because she's probably up there in the years, but probably just because I think it was one wine that just stuck in my mind, and I know a little bit about her that she had a pretty long history in making wines and making some wonderful wines.
Well, being a woman winemaker, a long time ago was probably a pretty unique thing.
No, for sure. She had some connection with the DRC, which is Domaine Romani Conti, which is ultra famous cult, and also
it's very expensive. That's all.
I don't know. I think her family may have been part of it at some point and split off, and that's one. But even here in California, what I'm intrigued about is the people, the Rocchiolis. Tom Dallinger, who's made some wine from Rocchioli and planted his own vineyard in the 70s. So people who were real pioneers, I think, in the Pinot specifically, part of making wine is that I'd be intrigued to share a bottle with. And some of it is, trying to find the source. I don't think for wine, finding the source is really elusive because it probably predates us a long, long time ago.
It's an old thing.
Yeah.
Wine is. Well, thank you for sharing your time with us. Deepak.
Yeah, my pleasure. Next time you pour a glass of wine, don't think, just sip.
I think that's going to look good on a bumper sticker.
Yeah.
This has been the Tall Mike Wine Podcast, Episode 1, with Deepak Gulrajani. Thank you so much. If you would like to give us any sort of feedback, my email address is available. It's tallmikewine@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at tallmikewine69. You can look at some pretty pictures of what I cook for dinner every night on Instagram at tallmikewine. That's really all I can tell you right now about me and the podcast. Hopefully, wherever you get your podcasts, you'll sign up to get ours on a regular basis. When we produce the second one, we'll put it up there and we'll get it ready for you as soon as we can. The show is conceived, written, produced, and edited by yours truly, and recorded on a program called Audacity. We hope to see you again sometime soon. From Nicholson Ranch, this is Mike Stone. Thanks for tuning in, and cheers to you.